Ben, I wanted to ask you, as someone who thinks about foreign policy and also American politics, I think the conventional wisdom would have been that someone who had Zoran Mamdani's position on Israel and Palestine, which is to the left of Bernie Sanders and AOC. I mean, he supports boycott, divestment, sanction. He does not support Israel as a Jewish state. He supports it as a state for equal state for all its citizens. That would not be a viable candidate for any significant office in the United States, right? And I think that would have been what I would have thought up until pretty recently. And yet he won in New York. Obviously, this race was not only about Israel and Palestine, but it did play a significant role. So how do you make sense of what has changed that made this possible?
I think that there are a number of things that we can unpack further if you want. I mean, first of all, Democratic politicians, I think, have been in a bit of a self-imposed prison on this issue, right? Like they're afraid to change talking points that were kind of embalmed 20 years ago, even though anybody who follows the issue could tell that circumstances were changing. Um, but then above all, after October 7th, I think in some ways it became impossible to kind of pretend like the Israeli government was in any way, shape, or form not committed to some policy of, at a minimum, ethnic cleansing and annexation, and was willing, obviously, to be kind of a serial committer of war crimes. And I'd highlight a few things. One is I actually think it's arguable that he would not have become mayor without his positions on this. Not, it's not what finished the job. What the reason he got elected is affordability. But I think what got him out of 1%, right, is he tapped into the frustration a lot of people were feeling about the lack of politicians who were willing to speak openly and honestly about their feelings about what was happening in Gaza. And so I think this allowed him to build, probably at the beginning, something of a larger base than he would have had. And then his message of affordability was able to propel him. Then I think that his own views may be to the left of Bernie and
Mhm.
in some ways mine,
Mhm.
but are closer to the base of the Democratic Party than Chuck Schumer's.
Mhm.
If you
Mhm.
look at recent public opinion polls, a majority of Democrats believe that genocide took place. A majority of Democrats do not believe that we should provide military assistance to Israel. A majority of Jewish Democrats believe war crimes took place, and in all those ways, he may be to the left of a lot of people, but he's still closer to the actual Democratic electorate than mainstream politicians. And then the last thing I want to say that's really important, Peter, is that I think that this issue helped him in an intangible way,
Mhm.
in that because he didn't look afraid
Mhm.
of all the shit he was going to get on Israel, right? Of the Bill Ackmans and the Jonathan Greenblatt attacks. I think people are more likely to believe that Zoran Mamdani will fight to lower my rent
Mhm.
because he actually believes in something. And I think this is something that the Democrats ignore at their peril, that like their positions, when they're mealy-mouthed on this stuff, when they look like they're just hiding from the issue, when they look like they're scared to offend donors or to get called names, it makes people think, well, these people will never fight for me on other things. Why should I believe that they'll stand up for, my health care or my rights in this country if they won't take a stand against what's happening in Gaza? And I think Zoran, captured a sense of authenticity and principle that was bigger than Gaza or Israel-Palestine with his positions because he was willing to say, you know what? No, I'm not going to just change my position now that I'm the nominee and I'm getting attacked on this thing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that makes a, I think that's a really, really important point. I'm also curious about, as again, as someone who's dealt a lot at the level of communications and how you communicate about foreign policy, what you noticed about how he addressed the issue, right? He had to address it again and again and again and again. And, you know, he struck me often as like a lot of these guys do who have more dissonant views, dissenting views on Israel-Palestine, that he was on a on a high wire where a lot of people were trying to knock him off every single moment of every single day. And generally, I thought he was remarkably sure-footed. I mean, maybe there are a couple of things where he could have said something slightly differently, but particularly because he had to walk this very fine line of not abandoning the sense of authenticity and principle, right? But also not walking into rhetorical traps that were being laid for him all the time, where people were going to say. And I'm curious what you noticed about the way he communicated it about this issue that you think Democrats could learn from.
Well, I think the first and most important thing is whatever you think about his views, they were clearly authentically his views,
Mhm.
right? And so part of what gets and I've prepped a lot of politicians in my time, Peter, where people get in trouble is that they kind of don't know what they really believe.
Mm,
And then
mm,
they're in while they're like answering, they're thinking like on this issue in particular, like, well, if I say this,
mm,
it will offend these people. If I say this, is that going too far? Or, and because he knew what he believed,
mm,
that was half the battle, right? Like,
mm,
you know, and he clearly had developed views on this. Then I think that he also was really good, especially in the general election, at navigating between, look, it might have been easy to just say, I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about affordability.
mm,
But like he would do that without dodging. He would kind of
mm,
reiterate an aspect of his belief and then pivot. You know, he wouldn't get drawn into like, hey, I'm just going to sit here and have a 1 hour debate about like Israel when I'm here to try to lower the the price of rent. But he wouldn't dodge it either. He'd kind of have an answer and then allow himself to turn. And then I also think the other thing he did is that that's important, and I think people on the left or whatever you want to call it these days on this issue, I don't even think it should be viewed as left right, but like people with views that are more willing to call out the Israeli government, are more willing to be supportive of Palestinian self-determination and rights. He explained his views, and I think that like I think of my 80-year-old Jewish mother in the Upper East Side who voted for him after having voted a different way in the primary. Um, he didn't just have a slogan. He would explain, here's what I mean, and for some, and that sometimes people think voters are dumb, like
mm, mm,
they're not. Like they're people that, especially in a fraught topic, they kind of want to know why you think something. And
mm.
he was willing to do that with patience and respect for, like the question, even if the question might have driven him crazy. And so I think all those things, again, lent him a bit of authenticity and credibility and allowed him not to persuade everyone, obviously, but to make some inroads. And he obviously has more work to do.
Yeah. So I think Ruwa Rahman has joined us. Ruwa is a state representative in Georgia, Palestinian American, running for governor. Ruwa, thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me, and I've just loved hearing what y'all are talking about. So this is great, and totally agree.
Okay, good, good.
Truly, like I actually need to put that up front. That's actually what I've been trying to tell a lot of folks.
Okay, well, I want to encourage people to put questions in the chat, and just to ask you as you go around in Georgia, um, what do you know, and even before you're running for governor, what do you notice, and what have you learned about how people relate to this particular issue, and how to be able to succeed politically as someone who has a kind of human rights oriented view when it comes to Palestine and Israel?
Yeah, so happy Friday, everybody, and thank you so much for having me back. It's lovely to see some of you again. And for those who don't know me, I'm Ruwa Romman. I'm a Georgia State representative. I'm also the only elected Palestinian in the state's history. It's me and Sam Rasool holding it down in this entire Southeast in terms of Palestinian representation. So it's just been definitely incredible. But a little background about Georgia, which I think sometimes really does get overlooked, is that the first campaign I ever volunteered for was the Michelle Nunn, Jason Carter campaign. And I remember this was back when you get a sheet of paper and go knock doors and you go back to headquarters. And I went back to them and I said, I really think we can turn Georgia blue if we expand this sort of direct outreach, deep canvassing work. And that was the first time anyone ever said to me, bless your heart. And I took that very personally. Um, and so that's sort of the work that I've been doing here for the past
Sorry,
more than,
can you translate "bless your heart" for folks who are not
bless your
don't speak
heart.
Southern?
Bless your heart is just a very passive aggressive way of calling somebody dumb, or at least like very naive. It depends on how it comes across. And I think in my case, it just sort of came across as, you're sweet, you're a college student at the time, you don't really know how any of this works. The best we can do is just, lower our margins. And I say all that to say that specifically what had happened was I looked around the room and most people did not look like me. It wasn't the broad coalition that I knew existed in Georgia. And not even 6 years later, we flipped not just once, but twice. We gave the country two senators. And we did it again and again. And just this past Tuesday, we won the Public Service Commission races, a down ballot race, by 26 points. Two statewide seats flipped. And so, how does that connect to something like this? It's specifically what y'all were saying, which is that voters are at a point right now where They are being squeezed from every direction, right? Utility bills are going up, student loans, food is increasing in cost, rent, housing, everything that people need to just survive, let alone live, and experience the American dream is becoming increasingly out of reach. And I remember specifically with my caucus colleagues, starting in, late 2023 into 2024, a lot of them were already like they had already been conditioned that when it comes to this issue in particular, that you just either don't say anything or you just toe the line as it relates to being pro-Israel. But they really struggled. One, having a Palestinian colleague was something most of them had never experienced before, and two, they knew better. And what we've seen shift over the past 2 years is this understanding that, wait a minute, there's power in numbers, and you can actually not only take the good human rights position and not be completely docked for it, but in fact, voters will now reward you. And what you and Ben were saying earlier about how if you do polling in Georgia, and in fact, anywhere, this is usually not in the top 5 issues that most voters care about. But when you go talk to them, and they will say, if you can't be honest about what we're seeing happening in front of us, how can I trust you to be honest about my bill? Like, who's responsible for why my quality of life is going down? How can I trust you that if you're in that negotiating room, are you actually going to stand up for me and put me first instead of whatever special interest can buy you out? The other thing in a state like Georgia is that we do have an Israeli consulate here that will show up to session, sometimes multiple times. And so there's been this sort of taboo, and actually specifically because of Zohran, I've had colleagues call me up and tell me that this was the first time they finally understood what I was saying in terms of how much voters have shifted on this. In fact, a recent AJC poll, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, not that AJC, put out a poll saying that a plurality of Democrats no longer view Israel as a good ally for the US. It wasn't even about sending bombs. It was just, should we maintain our alliance with the state of Israel? And the plurality of voters said no. In fact, it was like 50 something percent. And so the pendulum has really swung. It's not just young people, it's also older people. And there's also that deep history of the civil rights movement and the Palestinian movement that has really come back to the forefront.